Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. I am always am Chris Weave, not speaking for his employer. I'm not as good about remembering to say that early on as I used to be. And I've got with me Alec. Alec, I haven't seen you in seconds.
I know it's been forever, and I do speak for my employer
Because that's you.
Because it's me. Well,
So
when I'm speaking for Axanar, I'm speaking for my employer. If I'm speaking about Aries Studios, I guess that's my employer, but I really shouldn't be speaking for the studio. So who cares? I'm not dealing with national secrets. No one gives a damn. But I was reading the comments, got a lot of comments going.
Yeah. Everybody got started ahead of us. So usually I'm there sort of tossing things out early on, but Alec did sort of a impromptu Axanar After Dark, and I tagged in with that. So this is my second hour on the air, as it is for Alec. So
yeah, I got to say, it's so funny that yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, I did like a live stream, like, oh, I'm just going to do a live stream. And no, it was Thursday. I was like, and so I like literally like schedule it, launched it, and like whoever was online, and you know, and we didn't have many. We had maybe 10 to 15 people watching. Nothing, right? That's like me and my buddies. But now I just checked it before we came on. We had like 367 people had seen it. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? That, you know, but and I'm sure that. Anyway, it's just interesting to see how many people will watch a live stream once you're done. But yeah. And anyway, I see all your fans are here.
Yep, I see a lot of the usual suspects. So good to see you all. Thank you very much for coming this evening. So
what are we talking about tonight, Chris?
So for a while, so those of you who have been around for a while, who've been watching the show, may recall that last year, in the sort of April, May, June, July, early July timeframe, I was going through a bunch of stuff on naval warfare, with the idea being that I was talking about some seminal works of naval warfare that I had read, and I'd sort of go through and explain why they were important and what I learned from them, etc. And then I'd apply them to science fiction in general and Star Trek in particular. And then I ended up spending a week in the ICU and about 6 weeks recovering from that. And then about that same time, TJ Zazadlo came in and did a bunch of shows with us. So we ended up doing like 5 or 6 total with TJ, et cetera, et cetera. And the end result is I just haven't gotten back to that naval warfare series. And so about a month ago, at the beginning of March, I put together a presentation to the purpose of the presentation is to do 3 things. One was to get my head back in that space, because I was sort of on a roll and I got knocked off my roll. You know, I had to pick up the bicycle and sort of dust myself off, and now I'm getting back on the bicycle, and it was my way of getting back on the bicycle. Second thing is, I figured that those of you who saw it all before, same thing with you guys, right? Getting back into that same headspace, because I want to do more of that going forward. And the third thing is, for those who weren't here at that point, it'll give you a chance to sort of get up to speed. And my original plan was to do it all in one evening. It's 48 slides. That's an awful lot for one show. And then I'm talking with Alec earlier today, and Alec said, do you want me to be on the show? And I said, well, I tell you what, I had this idea about doing this presentation. I don't think you've seen any of that stuff. So how about I do it for you? And so I suspect that what I had originally conceived as being 1 episode, that probably realistically needs to be at least 2, might end up being 3, because feel free to stop me at any point. And so I figured I'd just sort of go I'd sort of go through all that stuff. And so I often say my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And so that's really what this is about. So as you can see, I didn't update the schedule, that somewhat Chris-centric schedule. I originally was going to do this on the 4th of March. That didn't happen. So I'm now willing to update my prior probability. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do a show on April 1st. And I haven't had a chance to go back and look at the calendar, but I know that I'm not traveling much this month at all. Trying to think, am I traveling at all? I'm traveling at the end of the month. At the very end of the month, I'm going to be out of town. But up until then, I should be around. So I think I'm probably doing shows the entire month. Pat is currently flying his airplane. Right now, as we speak, he's probably doing his takeoff roll because he had a 9 o'clock flight. And 9 o'clock his time zone. He's now, of course, I was originally planning to be doing this from Chris Carlson's house in Minneapolis. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the weather, but Minneapolis kind of got slammed. I was going to be driving up. The original plan was on Thursday. No, on Friday, I was going to drive up yesterday. I was going to drive from Des Moines up to Minneapolis, but they were predicting a high of 71, a low of 31, with a possibility of both snow and tornadoes.
Oh.
So it's like Iowa was going to have all the weather at once. So instead, for that and some reasons involving a computer that I thought might be having some potentially serious issues involving the battery, I ended up coming back to Dayton early. And so I'm here tonight in Dayton from my own apartment. So first thing, MarCon, which is in Columbus in late May. There's going to be the con, but I'm going to be there the day before the con starts. I'm going to be a fan guest of honor. I think they're calling me special fan guest, I think is what that's the title that they settled on. And I'm planning on having, I've reserved an extra space there, like a VIP suite. So, hey, people should, if you want to go to a science fiction convention and you're somewhere near the Midwest, MarCon's an excellent con to go to. So, so that's basically it for the announcements. Okay. So as I said, tonight I'm going to try to restart this naval combat discussion. So I started this series and I did a bunch of stuff early on. There were some question and answer sessions in there also. Tonight I'm going to do the thing that's in red, which is sort of the summary of what we've done so far, with an idea of moving forward into the future with those other things. That's sort of a tentative list. Some of it may fall off the list. I'm not sure, for instance, if I'm going to do the Michael Vlahos piece about what is a capital ship. I may or may not do that one. The torpedo boats and fighters thing is sort of up on my list of things to do. I'll probably do it right after I do Renegade Legion Prefect, because there's going to be I've been doing a lot of thinking about that recently, about how to think about fighters in science fiction and sort of what is the criteria for how to think about that. Because the environment gives you certain salient features, right? In an aircraft carrier in the real world is a way to have your cake and eat it too. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier functions as a doorway between the sea and the sky. It lets you have the features of an aircraft, which is long duration or long distance, very fast speed, high performance, with the advantages of a ship, which is, although they're slower, they can be a lot bigger and they can carry a lot more stuff with them, and they can hang around for a long time. So the flight deck of an aircraft carrier takes advantage of the fact it functions as a doorway between the medium of the sky and the medium of the ocean. Well, out in space, it's all one medium, right? You're not dealing with this transition. So just sort of taking your fighters and putting in space on the end. I never want anybody to come away thinking that they can't enjoy something that they previously enjoyed. That's not my goal in all of this, but I'd like people to be able to sort of sit back and go, "Oh yeah, I understand what he's saying there. I understand what are the important features, et cetera, et cetera." My goal, I'd love it if everybody here decided that they were going to go off and write a novel, and they came away figuring out how all that stuff fit together better, and they made their novel better as a result of being on the show. So that's kind of, in that regard, I sort of have the same goal that my friend Winchell Chung has in the Atomic Rockets webpage, which he specifically put that site together for people that were doing science fiction so that they would have a resource that they could use. And I sort of view myself as being a resource about that too. So I want to sort of re-examine what I did before to sort of get back into the rhythm of things so I can move forward into the future. So
Makes sense.
So I looked at 3 different people the last time, the works of 3 different people. I looked at Admiral Harris Lanning, who was a graduate of the Naval Academy and was president of the Naval War College back in the 1930s. I looked at Trent Hone, who's an amateur historian of some note. And by amateur, I mean that he has a day job that he uses to pay his bills. I don't mean that his work is amateurish, because it is not. It is very professional. He does some great work. And he focused on the development of the U.S. Navy surface doctrine in the interwar period.
That's an article?
He started off with an article called The Evolution of Fleet Tactical Doctrine in the U.S. Navy. And then and that went from 22 to 41. Then he did a follow-up article about the doctrine, how it changed during the war and how it was implemented. And since then, he's done a couple of books. One is about.
Whoops, is that me?
It's you.
I didn't know I could do. I didn't know I could have that effect.
You have the power, Alec. You have the power.
Yes, Alec. You can click the slides because we all use the same account.
Okay.
And so, so he turned this into a book. And then there's been a second book on that I think is called like Training for War, if I remember correctly, that was about sort of the educational pathway of these guys. Lanning's article is really about how to think about surface naval combat. And so he sort of encapsulates the thinking of the battle, of how to fight with battle lines and battleships in the interwar period. And then Karl Lautenschlager is an analyst who I did a couple of sessions on him. One of his articles was talking about what really made the dreadnought revolution revolutionary. And the other one was about called Technology and the Evolution of Naval Warfare. And it's about how naval warfare went from being short-ranged in one domain to adding domains onto it and becoming longer range, and how the fleet changed as a result of all of that. And so it includes the evolution of battle groups and new and different ship types, and how you think about that problem over time. And all these guys together really sort of give you an idea of what naval combat looks like in the 20th century. So let's start with Lanning. So the document that he wrote is called The Naval Battle. Especially if you're like a naval war gamer, the way I describe it to my naval wargaming buddies is, this is the article that explains why some of the things you do, why you do them. Even if you don't know why you do them, it explains why you do them. And it started off when he was a student at the Naval War College. He wrote a thesis paper. And then he comes back as president of the Naval War College like 10 plus years later, and he discovers that they're assigning his paper as required reading. At which point he said, I've had some major commands since then. I've done a lot of thinking. Let me rewrite the paper. And so he rewrites the paper, and it's printed as an appendix to his autobiography called An Admiral's Yarn. And you can find it out online. And it is a nice summary of how surface warfare worked circa 1933 when it was published, right? So this is how to think about fighting with the surface fleet. So he talks about how that there are several different weapons available, right? You've got guns, you've got torpedoes, and you've got mines. Guns are the most effective weapon in terms of their range, their accuracy, their rate of fire, their hitting power, and just, how many shots you've got, how many rounds you can carry. But guns supported by the other two is more effective than just guns by yourself. His point is your tactics need to be centered around the gun because guns are just so much more effective. And you use the other weapons to augment your gun line. So you think about, how can I use torpedoes in order to make my guns more effective? And the way that you can do that is by using your torpedoes to screw up the other guy's gun line. Because your battle lines are going to form up against each other, and you're trying to optimize your fire. He's trying to optimize his fire. The way that you can sub-optimize his fire is to use your torpedo forces to force him to maneuver. Right. So landing is sort of like Admiral Jellicoe made the comment at one point, like, I'm not afraid of that torpedo boats or destroyers with torpedoes are gonna hurt the battleships, because I can always maneuver. I can handle them. I don't want to handle them, right? It's the exact same reason why lawyers don't answer their own phones. They've got secretaries, because lawyers are very high paid. It's not, they need somebody else screening their calls, right? So right. It's the equivalent of screening your calls. I don't want to have to deal with the torpedoes. I'll let these other ships deal with the torpedoes.
Right.
I'm going to worry about optimizing my gun line. And so he also talks about the different types of ships, and that each one of those ship types is sort of focused around a primary weapon, right? And you operate the ship to make that primary weapon most effective. Now, like all sort of rules of thumb here, there are, there's exceptions to every rule. It's generally true, even though in specific instances it may be false. Like by the time World War II rolls around, destroyers are anti-submarine weapons. And so destroyers actually have one set of weapons to deal with the anti-submarine stuff. They've got other sets of weapons to deal with surface ships. The role of a destroyer, what's the primary mission of a destroyer? And the answer is, it depends. Am I a Brit? Am I an American? Am I a German? If I'm in, what's the primary role depends upon which one of those countries you are. But destroyers are weird in that regard. And you spend a lot of your time focusing on how to use your different ship types to their own advantage in support of the gun line. Now, Alec, I don't know if you've seen that triangle before. Have you seen that before?
Nope.
So that's from Winchell Chung, the aforementioned Winchell Chung of the Atomic Rockets of the Space Patrol website. So Winch is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for 20 plus years. Winch has some health issues. I am currently helping him with the site. And at some point, I will probably take over the site. The plan is for me at some point to take over the site and be the primary guy running it. And so, when a friend of yours calls up and says, I want to entrust my legacy to you, you take that seriously. So I'm taking that seriously. So the way that you read this is that those are percentages along the side, and he's sort of defining the trade-off in terms of how much of the mass of the ship you're dedicating to the functions of propulsion, weapons, and defenses, which in the case of a surface ship means armor generally. So this works best if you're sort of thinking like, say, 1935, what a ship looks like in 1935. And he's put down various ideas, various types of ships in terms of, sort of notional mass distributions. Now, he's got several of these on the website. This is specifically the science fiction one of them. So, which is why he says defenses instead of armor. And he also talks about things like scouts and couriers and fast attack fighters and a few things that sound more science fiction-y than actual navally. And so that's the reason for that. There's a trade-off with all those things, right? You get to decide how you're going to trade them off. If you're spending mass on one thing, you're not spending it on another. Propulsion in particular, like World War I British battle cruisers were the same size as battleships. They're actually physically bigger, but they're about the same displacement as the battleships. But the propulsion plant of one of those battle cruisers is twice the size of the propulsion plant of one of the battleships. They had twice as many boilers because they're aiming for speed rather than, and they got the speed by a small decrease in the number of weapons and a large decrease in the amount of armor they were carrying. Okay. So he talks about the different types of ships that you find and the general characteristics of them. So the thing to notice is that some of these things have high speed, some of them don't. Now, the U.S. battle line in the 20s and 30s was famous for being slow. Our battleships we had a much slower battle line, and we never built the battle cruisers that everybody else did.
Why was that?
Well, we were late to the party. In terms of the battle cruisers, we were late to the party. And as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty, we gave up our battle cruisers and we ended up turning them into the Lexington and Saratoga. So we ended up, and the common thought was you're going to put your battle cruisers at the vanguard. So you're going to put them up front. Your battle lines are going to be sort of fighting for position because what you want to do is cap the other guy's T, right?
Right.
And at the very least, I mean, if he lets you do that, then you've got him. He's not going to let you do that. He's going to turn that way.
Right.
And so you're going to force him to have a knuckle in his line, which means you're going to have all your guns bearing. He's only going to have some of his. He'll have more bearing than if he let you cap his T. But the idea is that you're probably going to be fighting for position. And so you want to put fast, powerful forces up front. Now, Lanning makes the comment that, hey, that all looks great on paper. In practice, it's really hard to use battle cruisers in a way where they're both far enough away from the rest of the line to influence that battle, to do their job, yet not so far away from the line that they lose the support of the line and they don't end up hanging themselves out to dry. And you see that in the Battle of Jutland, where there are time periods where, Beatty's out alone and unafraid, and he gets pounded pretty badly. Now, it didn't help the fact that through some things that were sort of a combination of design issues and procedural issues, that the fact that German shells were sort of better than they thought they were going to be, that the Germans were able to take out some of those ships pretty quickly. Part of that was that they thought they had enough safety margin built in that they could turn off some of the safety procedures, and it turns out they were wrong. In my experience from all the naval exercises I did, the most dangerous time is when somebody thinks that they've got situational awareness and therefore it's okay for them to turn off a safety procedure. That's a really good way to get yourself in trouble. And that's kind of what happened with Beatty. And so let's see. So those are the different types of ships that we see there in battle. Let's see. So I think I've said most of this already, that we're going to try to, with the expectation is that we're going to end up in parallel lines because both sides are fighting for position. Both sides you should assume are competent. Maybe you'll get lucky. Maybe you're better than the other guy is, and you'll be able to cap his T. You'll be able to maneuver. Chances are we're probably going to end up in parallel lines. Oh, going back to part of implicit in your question, our battle line was slow because basically we decided that when it came time to to fight the battle, both sides are going to want to fight the battle, right?
Right.
We're going to force them to fight the battle by threatening something that they have to defend, or they're going to do that to us. So we're both going to want to fight the battle. The advantage of speed to do the maneuvering, that's important. But the U.S. Navy made a conscious decision that we wanted firepower and armor over speed. So we built a slow battle line, but we also built a uniform battle line. They all had approximately the same turning radius. They all had approximately the same speed. The Brits had a lot of different options for speed, which meant you go according to the slowest one. If everybody's got different turning radii, you really need to practice that to make sure that you don't screw up your formation when you turn. We decided that it was just easier to standardize on a big gun and to standardize on a general set of speed performance characteristics, and that everything else would sort of work itself out. And we also practiced gunnery a lot. So we didn't deploy in the same way that we do now. We didn't patrol in distant waters, et cetera, but we were at sea all the time. We practiced a lot. We were a garrison force, but that didn't mean that we sat in port. We did a lot of underway time. So the thinking is that we're going to be able to, hold our own in the battle line. Now, when we talk about Trent Hone, I'll explain about how what Lanning is saying there is at best something that changed later on, and at worst, he's lying to us. The document that he wrote was confidential at the time, but confidential is a relatively low-level classification. And we had, at least by the time World War II rolled around, we had some tricks up our sleeve. And his document does not reflect the tricks that we had up our sleeve. I need to go back and check with Trent Hone's work, maybe to actually ask Trent when exactly we started getting tricky about this stuff. I don't remember exactly when it was. It's entirely possible that Lanning wasn't lying to us, wasn't lying to his audience. Or it may be possible that he was. I have to go and double check the timeline. So, okay, battle cruisers, if we had them, are useful in bending the opponent's battle line. They can support friendly light forces on the flanks. They can strike the opponent's flanks themselves. But as I pointed out earlier, you still have to be within range of your own battle line. Otherwise, you risk being defeated in detail. One of the things about naval warfare is that it's really slow, relatively speaking. I mean, by the time World War II rolls around, an Iowa-class ship can shoot 20 miles. But if it's going 20, if it can shoot 20 nautical miles, but its speed is only 30 nautical miles, it takes 40 minutes to get to where the shell landed, which is about as opposite from what you see in Star Trek as you can get. Imagine the idea that you fire a phaser and it's got a certain range and it takes you 40 minutes to get to the maximum range of the phasers. Everything in Star Trek happens at point blank range. So this means that it's easy, if you let your battle cruisers get out too far in front of you, they can take quite a pounding before you can support them. And that's assuming that you've got the freedom of action to support them. You might not. You might be in a situation where if you go to support the battle cruisers, you're gonna distort your own line enough that you're going to give the other guy an advantage. So Lanning makes an explicit point that to the effect of battle cruisers seemed like a really good idea, but in practice, nobody was really able to make them work like they did on paper. So destroyers are mostly about screening screening against submarines, but also to attack the enemy to force him to turn his battle line, or to if he, to take advantage of opportunities to screw up his battle line. And light cruisers are about scouting and supporting the destroyers. Now, it's funny, light cruisers are about scouting, except in the end, they ended up not really being about scouting, because these things called airplanes came along. So we developed a set of tactics based upon the idea that we were going to use cruisers for scouting, and then as a general rule didn't, except at night. We did use them at night for that. Cruisers are kind of the workhorses, and that means that you're willing to put them in positions where you wouldn't be willing to put battleships. You send them into danger, you put them in restricted waters. If you lose one or two, you can live with it, but they've got enough armor and enough gunpowder that they can generally fight their way out of any problems they run into. So cruisers are really kind of interesting in that regard. Okay. Let's see. What do I want to highlight from this? So one of the things that he talks about is a couple of things that I think that are important. Is that he talks about how you don't want to deploy too soon. You don't want to into the battle line. You don't want to deploy too late. You want to, timing is everything in this regard. So you need to make sure that you can get your light forces into position to support the battle line. This is another reason why we decided that speed wasn't really that essential in the battle line. We're not going to fight the battle, even if we could fight it at 30 knots, we're not going to. Because if you are operating at full speed the entire time, it means that anybody who's out of position can't get back into position. And part of what's going to happen in this is that your battle line is going to get into position. It's going to be doing its thing, and the light forces are going to be moving around it. And so the light forces need to have enough of a speed advantage that they can get to where they need to be while the battle line is doing its thing. And so the battle line's probably going to be going 20 knots anyway. So having a battle line with a top speed of 23 knots isn't that big a deal, because it's probably only going to be doing 20 knots to make sure that everybody else has enough of a margin over the battle line to be able to get to where they need to be. Let's see. And at the time that this was going on, we separated the U.S. fleet into the battle force and the scouting force. And the scouting force had, in general, was more cruiser heavy, had fewer battleships. The battle force was where most of the beef was. And for a long time, the scouting force was in the Atlantic and the battle force was in the Pacific. It's important, though, the scouting force was going to do strategic scouting. This wasn't about tactical scouting for when the battle's going to happen. It was about strategic scouting of like going long distances and sort of trying to pin down where the enemy fleet might be coming out of. It isn't about scouting right before the battle starts. So he specifically says, don't assume that the scouting force is going to be able to fall back on the fleet before the battle starts, because they may just not be anywhere nearby. You may have to fight without them. So don't come up with any tactics that depend upon the scouting force being there, because they may not be. So let's see. So he talks about mutual support with the gun line. It's all about the gun line. You should focus on your objectives. It's good to have secondary objectives, but you need to know when to stop pursuing the secondary objective because it's getting in the way of the primary objective. So your secondary objective might be chase the guys when they run, right? They turn around and leave, we're going to pursue. But at some point, it's like, okay, I haven't caught them, but it's time to turn back because I've got this primary objective that requires me to go back at this point. Pay attention to the environment. You want the wind blowing in the direction that you're shooting, not back in your eyes. But you don't want to be staring into the sun. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. You do want to be staring into the sun. You want the other guy silhouetted to the sun. You don't want the sun behind you. You want the sun in front of you because it will silhouette him. It'll make you harder to see and him easier to see. And you should set your fleet up in such a way that it makes that if you are surprised, that it doesn't prevent you from concentrating. We spent a lot of time thinking about cruising formations and stuff like that. Now, one of the things that I think is worth pointing out at this point, if you sort of look through all the different list of things that I've talked about here, does this sound like Star Trek? I don't think it really sounds like Star Trek at all. I think these are all things that I would love to see in an episode of Star Trek that we usually don't see. But, you know, for most of Star Trek, up until fairly deep into Deep Space Nine, if you had 5 ships on the screen at the same time, that was a huge battle. So Wolf 359 is an exception. We got our butts kicked. But up until Deep Space Nine, you didn't really see things that looked like a fleet action. And it's always unclear to me how much of Star Trek doctrine is embodied in their computers. I think there's a lot of things they don't say, but I also think that there's a lot of things that they don't necessarily think through. I don't, and by they in that, there's a lot of things that the Starfleet officers on the screen don't say, and there's a lot of things that the writers don't think through. Right? I don't want to besmirch the integrity of Starfleet there. It's not the Starfleet that doesn't think through things, it's that the writers don't think of them through. This, incidentally, is one of the reasons why I really liked Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda for the first couple of seasons before Kevin Sorbo took over, is because they actually had a retired surface warfare officer on their staff. And I see the signs that they thought about a lot of this stuff, I think, a lot more than your average Star Trek writers did. I think they did a good job at thinking about that. Okay, so what did we learn from landing? We learned that combatants are usually designed for a specific role. That means that they're usually built around a weapon system with the other attributes designed to be complementary to that weapon system. You can never get everything you want, you know, so you have to do that trade-off that Winch embodies in that triangle graph. For example, battleships are large because they need to carry big guns and they need the size to be stable and to support large magazines. So you have to have a big ship. Battleships have to be big by the time you add all that stuff on. Cruisers don't have to be big because they don't need those things. So if there is a dominant weapon system, and there usually is, but sometimes it's less clear than others, the best answer is usually to build around that weapon system. We see an instance of it being less clear if you dial back to like the 1890s. Everybody kind of agrees that the weapon system is the gun, but there's a lot of different types of guns back then, and it's unclear as to whether you want smaller caliber that fires faster or larger caliber that fires slower. There was a legitimate professional disagreement, and both sides could make a pretty good argument. So that issue of dominant weapon system defines roles for all the combatants, not just the ones that are carrying that weapon system. So what that means is if the dominant weapon system is the gun, it's all about the gun line. Everybody else is supporting the gun line, and you design ships to support the gun line. And you're forcing the other guy to optimize his deployment of his primary weapon system and to optimize the deployment of yours. I would argue sensor range is extremely important. And that is sensor range and weapons range is important because that affects when you start doing deployment, right? If you can be surprised, you don't have time to get into your deployment, you need to be traveling in a formation that minimizes the danger of that surprise. A lot of this boils down to, like, the U.S. Navy would traditionally travel during this time period in a circular formation, which had the advantage that when you turn to meet the threat, you could sort of collapse into a line quite easily. Whereas if you're in a linear formation, the entire line has to sort of snake its way over to where it's going. And that's a lot less flexible, and under certain circumstances, it could be problematic. That gets to the last point here, that the approach is as important as the engagement itself. That you need to sort of think through how you're going to approach the guy, when you're going to shift from one formation to the other, how that sort of transition happens. So, Alec, you've been silent.
I'm just taking it in. Reading some of the comments as well, and so because a lot of people have a lot of comments, but yeah, it's real. Listen, out of my area of expertise, I love naval warfare. I think it's fascinating, but haven't studied it. So the thing that I always think of as you're talking about all this stuff too is there's also the difference between planning and execution. And the thing that hits me is the inaccuracy of guns during the 20th century.
Well, that's interesting, because there's a book by an author named Robert O'Connell called Sacred Vessels, the Battleship and the Cult of Battleship and the Cult of the Navy? No. The Cult of the Battleship in the U.S. Navy, or something like that. It's a horrible book. It's horrible. And but he encapsulates a primary problem that people have with thinking about battleships. He makes the comment that at the beginning of the battleship era, the hit rate for the big guns was between 3 and 6%. And at the end of the battleship era, the hit rate was between 3 and 6%. And so therefore there had been no progress in that 50-year, 40-year time period. The beginning of the battleship era, those hits are taking place at 2,000 to 4,000 yards. The end of the battleship era, they're taking place at like 20,000 yards, 20 to 30, So I don't know about you, but that sounds like progress to me.
Right. And also what 3 to 6% hit rate. Okay. What is the damage that 3 to 6% does as well?
The shells,
I'm guessing it's a lot more.
The shells are a lot bigger. They've got a lot better penetrating capability. And what O'Connell fails to understand is he doesn't understand what's the dependent and the independent variable in that equation. So gun battles take place in general at the range. Both sides get a vote. They're both maneuvering, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason why the hit rate's about 3 to 6% is that's what naval officers are comfortable with. So, it's not that you hold the range constant and the hit rate goes up. It's like, no, you hold the hit rate constant and the range goes up.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
And in part of that is you start shooting earlier. As your fire control gets better, you just start shooting earlier. So the difference between the guns on the Dreadnought, talk a little bit more about this when we get the Lautenschlager. The difference between the guns in the Dreadnought and the guns on the generation of ships before that, the pre-Dreadnoughts before that, they're the same gun. There's not new guns, but the hit rate goes up dramatically. Why does the hit rate go up dramatically? Because you start introducing fire control type stuff. So you start introducing salvo firing and continuous aim and range finding and director control. And, you add all these things together. And as I'll talk about it when we get there, all held together by the miracle of electricity. Because electricity gives you the ability to have hydraulics that move your turrets around relatively fast. You're not got guys cranking it. You're not trying to pump steam there. You can use hydraulics. It means that you can talk. You've got intercoms that you can talk to people on, and you're not trying to use a voice tube in the middle of the loudest sound known to man, a gun battle. You're not trying to shout down a tube and the other guy's trying to hear it. And you can have things like engine telegraphs and other things where, like, I set the knobs, and on somebody else's screen the numbers come up. Or better yet, it automatically sets his gun. I set it, the guy in fire control, he sets the range, and everybody else moves their gun accordingly because they can read the numbers off. So electricity is sort of key to holding this all together.
Yeah, right.
But it's the same guns. But they had this, the range doubled and then doubled again. All this at the same time, the hit rate's going up. Also, the ships are getting bigger, so there's more guns. That helps too. And you stop with all this small gun stuff. And the thing about the small gun stuff, what people don't fully appreciate, is that the reason why the small guns went away in large part was because the range went up. And so you've got these guns. Having a lot of short range, quick firing stuff maybe made sense when you were at short range and you can't hit, and it's like next to impossible to hit with the big guns. So I'd rather have a lot of little guns sort of whittling them down, right? Pew, 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 pew. That makes a lot more sense. But once the range goes up, those little guns don't have the range anymore. And once I've gone from once I get to the point of salvo firing and everybody's firing at the same time, and I've got, if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to solve that problem that way, I need a bunch of guns that have similar ballistics characteristics.
Right.
So by the time as fire control gets better, the range goes up with the same guns.
Yeah, and listen, of course I play World of Warships, so
yeah,
a lot of what I know is from seeing all the different warships, and and so what you see is that in the earlier battleships, you do see more different caliber guns, but by the time you get into all the late war stuff, a battleship has two types of guns. It's got its main guns and it's got anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in between because it's not those guns aren't going to shoot anything because the battleships at a range that those guns are not effective. That's what cruisers are for.
And all throughout World War I, the fire control got better. And by the time you got to 1920, all the navies start doing modifications on their battleships to increase the elevation of the guns because now they can shoot farther. And their turrets weren't designed to let the guns go up to shoot at maximum range because you're never going to take a maximum range shot because you can't hit at maximum range. Well, the fire control got better. Maybe now I can hit at maximum range. All right. It can certainly hit further. And the main limitation on how far I could shoot was the elevation of the guns. And so it's almost like, to put it in gaming terms, it's almost like they didn't have the extreme range band. And you had to modify the turret to add the extreme range band on. Same gun firing the same shell, but it can now fire further because the gun can elevate farther. All the gun trajectories in World War I were relatively flat, which also meant, this gets into some interesting things with regard to armor. It meant you've got all these World War I warships that emphasized armor on their sides, because that's where they're most likely to get hit. And so some of those warships hang around until World War II, like, for instance, the HMS Hood. She was armored like a World War I warship because she was one. She didn't really have a whole lot of armor on her deck. She was supposed to go in for a refit. If the Bismarck chase had happened 6 months later, she would have had a new armor on her deck. But that didn't happen because she had to go out and deal with Bismarck. And they knew they had a vulnerability there. That's why Hood was basically charging Bismarck, because she needed to get close.
Right.
So that she could avoid plunging fire.
Right.
Same thing happened in Guadalcanal with Washington versus Hiroshima versus South Dakota. Kirishima was a battleship that had started off as a battle cruiser. It was a World War I battle cruiser that they had basically put an extra layer of armor around it. Washington at that point was one of the newer ships in the fleet. I mean, South Dakota had come out, so Washington's like the second newest battleship in the fleet at that point. And she's got a hot shit gun and was designed with a modern armor protection scheme. Kirishima had no real business being in that fight. They're both battleships, but one of them was really a battleship. And South Dakota, it's easy to hate on South Dakota because the engineer in South Dakota set the wiring in such a way you can adjust how you do all the circuits. And they had a problem where the first time they had a good shock, which I think was from them firing their own guns, the circuit breaker tripped and it took all the circuit breakers. And so they go cold and dark in the middle of the battle. And you sort of look at that and you go like, this is dumb, right? How stupid do you have to be? That's a Bush League mistake. And that's what I thought for a decade plus, maybe 2 decades. I then learned something that sort of made me, that was a little hasty of me. And what I learned was that was her first underway period since she got into the fleet, into the Western Pacific. That was her shakedown cruise, basically. She had just shown up in Pearl Harbor, and Halsey said, congratulations for your shakedown cruise. You're going to go fight a battle. Because Halsey was really desperate. We didn't have the ships that we needed. I mean, the entire idea that you would send 2 battleships at night into constricted waters like those around Guadalcanal. I mean, he basically said it to them. This is insane. This is exactly what we've always told people never to do. I'm going to do it. And they got lucky. And Admiral Willis Lee, the commander on board Washington, who was the best gunnery expert in the United States Navy, he told, I think it was Mark Mitchner later on, he said, yeah, we got lucky. We don't want to do that ever again. Change a couple of the die rolls and you end up with 2 U.S. battleships torpedoed and on the bottom of the Guadalcanal. It could have been bad. So, it's interesting, trying to think about how these things match up with how Star Trek works and how some other science fiction shows work. I frequently give the countervailing examples of Honor Harrington on the one hand and Babylon 5 on the other. In Honor Harrington, David Weber has thought through all this stuff. He's really got a pretty good understanding. He understands how fleet tactics work. He's thought through how his ships fight, and he's really big on doctrine. He's really big on pre-planned responses. They're not just making it up. I love Babylon 5. I think it's fantastic, but it always drives me crazy when they're constantly improvising stuff. Although, in all fairness to them, the one example I always use is they've got this set piece battle. They're going to battle. They come out of the jump gate, and Sheridan starts barking orders. Little ships cover big ships, blah, 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 blah. And it's all stuff that's like, oh, well, yeah. Like, that's sort of like saying, remember to breathe while you're in the battle. You should take a breath every 10 seconds or so. Okay, yeah, they're professionals. They should know that. Okay, I'm maybe willing to give them a little bit of, maybe he's just reminding them he's got a multi-species force, not used to working together. Maybe I should be a little bit more generous and say he's just reinforced. They've covered it all in the training doctrine, right? Trying to get them all on the same page. Maybe he's just trying to remind them of the fundamentals so that they don't go running off and doing stupid shit. Okay, that could be. We saw what happened in the Pacific when you end up with a scratch force thrown together like that with the ABDA force. Australia, Britain, Dutch, and American, which basically all the ships that weren't sunk like right after Pearl Harbor, they sort of put them all together, put the Dutch admiral, who was a senior officer present in command, and said, "You're the Abda force." And that lasted for about, I think, maybe 3 weeks. And then they ran into a battle where the Japanese sunk like half the force. And the ones that were left sort of said, "Okay, we're done. Every man for himself, try to evade and get out." And I think that's where we end up with the great story about the destroyer that disguised itself as an island. And during the day, it would just sort of sit up next to the coast with all sorts of trees and stuff. And then at night, it would move like half a mile away, and then just sort of, and it just sort of did that until it got far enough away that they could actually, they could actually put the pedal to the metal and speed away. I can't remember the name of the ship, but it's a fantastic story. They knew that they were going to get trapped behind enemy lines, and so they covered the ship in tree limbs and stuff like that, and were able to hide the ship.
That's just, oh God, that's hysterical. That's hysterical.
So let me take a look here real quick and see what we've got for comments. Yeah, so Wright says something, and have your tactical action officer or flag officer understand the importance of good sensors to detect the opposition first and attack on that intel. So attack effectively first. When we get to Wayne Hughes, Wayne's big thing was attack effectively first. And so when we get to fleet combat and Fleet Tactics in Coastal Combat was the second edition of the book. The first edition was Fleet Tactics, Theory and Practice. And the third edition, I think, is Fleet Tactics and Naval Operations. When we get to that book, we'll talk about attacking effectively first. Yep, Kevin Sorbo did indeed hijack Andromeda. There was a as Wilhelm asked, why did he do that? There was a huge sort of turnover at that time, both in the cast. The guy who played Tiranazi left because his contract was up, and somebody made him a better offer, so he went off to be on some nighttime soap opera or something like that. And they, for some reason, they decided that Kevin Sorbo was the guy to make their showrunner. And so he basically took over. At some point, I'm going to make myself sit down and watch it all the way through. But I had stopped watching it by that point because it was just problematic. But there's a lot of things that I liked about that show. Haven't seen it in a while. Maybe I'll come back and eat these words later. But okay, let's see.
No, Brian, I just had one shot in my coffee, and I've been drinking coffee all night.
So Wilhelm says hit rate for Star Trek ships is -2%. That's actually not true. And that's one of the things that's really, I think, significantly different about Star Trek versus naval combat, at least in this time period, is in this time period, if you hit with a 16-inch shell, it's going to hurt. But it was hard to hit with 16-inch shells. It was hard to get those hits in. In Star Trek, phasers hit all the time.
Yeah, they hit shields mostly.
They hit shields, and you got to get through the shield. You got to bang the shield down, right? So you're constantly hitting. They may not be effective hits because your armor's stopping it, your armor in the form of your shields, but you're hitting all the time. And that's, I mean, the number of times you see phasers miss is relatively small. And I'd have to go back and do a serious study on photon torpedoes, but I'd be willing to bet that most of the time it's when photon torpedoes are fired against maneuvering ships is when photon torpedoes miss. So I'll admit I need to sort of sit down and do a little bit more thinking about that. One of my goals in all of this is to eventually get to sort of the big picture gestalt, where I can sort of sit down and say, okay, this is how real world naval combat works in this time period, and let's compare side by side real world naval combat with Star Trek combat, and here's the differences, and here's why the differences are important, and here's where they're not important, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the lens that I use to look at science fiction, because I learn stuff about how it works in the real world, and then I sort of hold that up next to whatever else I'm looking at and go, okay, does that match? What can I learn by comparing them that way? Okay. Okay, David Coxwell asks, how would the rebooted Enterprise from the motion picture face off against Darth Vader's flagship, the Executor? Or Executor, depending upon how you view it. So I'm not going to answer this question for two reasons. The first reason is I generally don't talk about Star Wars combat, because I understand that if you're deep into the legacy universe, you can squint in certain ways and argue that it all makes sense. You have to spend a lot of time on the Star Wars technical commentaries page to see all the stuff that was done by the people that were actually technical consultants to it, because there apparently is a consistent framework behind a bunch of it, but it's really tough to see how that comes out in the show. And so I generally just avoid Star Wars examples, because Star Wars is a universe where if you need to flush your toilet, you have to go out to your mailbox. And nobody's ever heard of a guardrail, and to me it just I just can't wrap my head around it. I don't think there's enough there that's consistent for me to actually talk about Star Wars. The second reason I generally have a thing against doing, which would win the Battlestar Galactica or the Death Star, or I generally don't do that stuff, because they're all predicated on an entirely different set of technological assumptions.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Physics doesn't work the same in those two different universes. It's nowhere near as close as comparing apples and oranges. It's comparing it's comparing
apples and landmines.
Apples and landmines, or maybe, apples and the means of production.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I mean, they're not even, I'm not even sure they're both nouns. And so I don't think that there's, now you could maybe argue, but Chris, isn't that what you're doing here? No. I'm holding two things up next to each other and using how a historical example works to see if I can gain some understanding about how science fiction works. I never say anything like, well, what would win the USS Enterprise from Star Trek or an Iowa class battleship?
Right.
Because I think the Enterprise versus the Executor makes no more sense than saying an Iowa class battleship against the Enterprise. So sorry, David, I'm not even gonna go there. Let's see. I'm scrolling. So Dabbling Warlock asks, was Washington and North Carolina or South Dakota? She was the second of the two North Carolina class. There's only one North Carolina left, and that is, wait for it, the North Carolina, which is located in, wait for it, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And I've never been to it. I've never seen
Wilmington?
that. I think that's where it is, but I've never been to it. I need to go. I've been to the USS Massachusetts, which is in Fall River, Massachusetts, and it's my favorite museum ship. It's fantastic. I've been on the New Jersey, and I've been on the Wisconsin. I've been on the Wisconsin 3 or 4 times, and the New Jersey once. I'm hoping in September that I'll have the weekend off in between a couple of events when I'm going to be down in. going to be down in Montgomery, Alabama, which puts me about 3 hours away from Mobile, where the USS Alabama is. So I'm hoping to go get a chance to go down and see that. But that's another SODAC. But I need to go see the North Carolina, and I really need to go see that. And it turns out, I know, for very small values of I know the museum director at the North Carolina. He's a former U.S. Navy Commodore named Terry Bragg, who I met aboard USS O'Kane during RIMPAC 2002. He was the Sea Combat Commander on board. And he had been a shipmate of one of my mentors at CNA back when they were both lieutenants. And so, and I got to watch him and his crew work. And it was sort of interesting because that was after 9/11. We were busy invading a country at the time, or getting ready to. We'd invaded one, we were getting ready to do another. And as a result of that, we sort of threw together this exercise, and they took Commodore Bragg's command from San Diego, and they were a training command. They didn't usually deploy. They were a shore-based command. And they said, you guys are going to deploy. And he went, wait a minute, what? It's like, no, really, we're going to send you to sea to do this exercise because nobody else is available. So congratulations, you're it. And so he brought his very senior and his very junior people with him to give the junior people some experience. And it was a total no threat environment. I mean, it was a low stress environment because nobody expected them to do particularly well, because this wasn't their shtick. This wasn't what the thing that they trained to do. And so everybody was just having a blast. And it's the most fun I've ever had at sea. And they were a joy to work with. They were a joy to work with. So,
well, about how far are you through the presentation?
I'm about a third of the way through. And so I'm gonna be doing this at least one more time. And I'm just sort of
making 3 episodes, make it 3 episodes.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to end up being 3 episodes.
It's all good info. I next time, I think what we should do is plan, do a page and then a Q&A, and the page and the Q&A. And something.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think
be a little more interactive.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. So we'll do that. So part of this, like I said, this is a summary of stuff that I've already done once before, but part of this is that, my plan all along has been to sort of like, I want to create content that I can refine. In this particular case, you guys are getting to see it a second time. And so on the one hand, some of you, it's going to be, it's going to sound a little bit old hat, but on the other hand, I see all the people here that are the regulars, and they're chiming in also. They don't seem to be bored. And I'm trying to make this stuff better because I want to get this in a format where it can be exposed to more people. And so I'm using this venue as a way to polish this. And so I appreciate everybody doing that. So I appreciate everybody being here. Wilhelm asked the question, was space above and beyond militarily realistic? I thought it was. So I have to go back and watch it again because I haven't seen it since it was in its original release. I have the DVDs. I need to go back and watch it again. There's stuff that I thought at the time was very good. There's other stuff I thought that was less so. I should hasten to add 2 things. One was, at the time I watched that, I was a guy who had intended to be a defense analyst, but instead was a computer geek because the Berlin Wall had gone down. And if the price of a safer world is that I have to go to plan B for my career, I'm willing to jump on the grenade for everybody. I didn't transition back to being a defense analyst until after the show was off the air. And so at the time that I watched it, I did not have the filter of being a naval analyst, let alone 20 years of being a naval analyst to sort of view that through. The second thing is, it was 20 some years in the past, and I've talked with people. It's like, well, maybe this part makes sense, and et cetera. And the response I got was, no, it doesn't. It's not as good as you remember it. Okay, I'm looking forward to going and seeing it again to see if it was as good as I remember it or not. I do remember thinking that it was really weird that you would take pilots and have them do ground pounder stuff.
Yeah, same here.
Now, we know that the real reason for that is you've got 7 stars and you want to, yeah, exactly that. And, it's the thing where it's their variation of, we're at this planet we've never been to. We think it's incredibly dangerous. Let's send down the captain, the first officer, and 2 other members of the senior bridge crew, and then 1 guy who's expendable.
Yeah.
It's their version of that.
Yeah.
That having been said, there are times where you are forced to eat your own seed corn, right? So the real question in my mind is, what was not why did they do that? Or, it's not, it was stupid for them to do that. It's like, okay, what exactly was the strategic value of the mission they were doing? If you're in a situation where you need to evacuate some civilians from a planet and the only force you've got is those guys to send down and help evacuate those people, you might be willing to take the risk. If it's a strategically significant mission, you might be willing to take the risk. But at some point, and I say this as somebody who has a degree in strategy, at some point you need to sort of sit back and say, okay, here's the resources I've got. Here's what my overall strategic goals are. Maybe I need to let this one go.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe I'm overextended. Maybe I can't do everything. Maybe I need to let this one go. Right. We were willing, if you look at what happened at like the Battle of Midway, those ships are effectively combat, the winning side, our side, those ships are effectively combat ineffective after the battle because we basically lost so many air crew. It's not like we could have turned around and done it again against a fresh force. We took it on the chin. We lost entire squadrons. And we won. But that was about winning the war. That battle in 1942 set up all of the successes we had in the Pacific after that. So that was clearly worth it. But under what circumstances are you willing to basically take away an entire deck load of aviators?
Dabbling Warlock, I'll take a look for these. Do me a favor and send me a message on Facebook or send me an email, alec@axanar.com, and I'll look to see what's up with these.
So I know that there was 1 or 2 episodes that got that had like a copyright strike. I think there was one that you took down for some reasons involving your lawyer, if I remember correctly. But there was one that had a copyright strike against it. So I think that there should be 2 that aren't on the list. Stogie may be playing around with what's showing up where, because I know he's trying to massage the algorithm. And I've got on my list of things to do is to make some sort of complete lists of stuff. I've noticed that sometimes it's actually harder to find stuff than it should be. So I want to make sure the playlists are up to date and we've got stuff archived. And I've also want to do like a separate Facebook page to be better about announcements and stuff like that. And all that stuff fits in the category of stuff that I need to just basically sit down and spend an afternoon doing it. Finding an available afternoon when I'm in the mood to sort of do that stuff and do it right is harder than I'd like it to be, actually. So, yeah, a lot of sci-fi or just military shows are about having all the characters you care about do a lot of jobs. Space Above and Beyond wasn't that different from Black Sheep or Combat or Rat Patrol or things like that. I think the difference between that is, for most of those shows, people were sort of doing the thing that they do, right? Like, in no episode of Rat Patrol did they say, okay, for this episode, you're going to be fighter pilots.
Right.
Right. In no episode of Black Sheep Squadron did they say, for this episode, you're going to be ground pounders.
Right.
And so they get the special missions, but they're generally doing them as the thing they do. What made Space Above and Beyond weird was the fact that they were doing something so outside of what their general job was. That having been said, I didn't finish this thought beforehand. They are losing badly at that point in the war, in Space Above and Beyond. And we're also in a situation where they talk early on about how interstellar travel does not sit well with some people. I mean, they have a physical reaction to it. So your available manpower pool was quite limited. And they didn't get into the economics of it, but I sort of got the impression that that's a universe where faster than light travel is really expensive, I think. And so, like, when you add all that stuff up, it's desperate times and you don't have the bodies. And it's sort of like at one point in Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined series, there's a Cylon ship that has actually sort of crashed into the Galactica, and there's Cylons loose on the ship. And they say something like, how many Marines do we have? And the answer is 4. Because that's just all they got. And so they're having to send guys that aren't Marines down to fight the Cylons because they got like 4 guys. That's sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures.
Well, I've got a cat that's screaming at me for food.
And we are at the hour and 16-minute mark, so it's time to declare victory. As Senator Aiken from Vermont said about the Vietnam War, it's time to declare victory and get the hell out.
There we go. Very good. Well, great show.
All right. So hopefully you can come back next week. Can you come back next week? All right. Absolutely. So we'll do Trent Hone next week.
Yeah, love to. Love to. That'd be great.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. As always, it's a pleasure to have you join me on Saturday night. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
A pleasure, everyone. Thanks. Take care and stay